Today is July 21st, 2024. The conflict in Ukraine continues. Increasingly, the Western media, Western governments, even the Ukrainian government, are gradually acknowledging the fact that Ukraine is losing this proxy war. It is a proxy war being fought by the United States, the rest of NATO, against Russia through Ukraine. I'm going to get into a number of articles about this general sense of Ukraine losing this conflict, and then articles that get into the specific details as to why they're losing this conflict. But first, let's take a look at the map. This is liveuamap.com. It is a pro-Ukrainian live map, so keep that in mind when we look at it. There are not a lot of drastic changes, but what you will notice, say from July 1st to July 21st, you will notice that in these different areas where the fighting is taking place, which is mainly in the Donbas region, but also around Kharkov, Zaporozhye, Kherson, you will notice that Russia is incrementally gaining ground. They are gaining ground. They are taking territory, especially in places where it was previously unthought of that they would be able to move in. These areas were so heavily defended, but this is how overstretched Ukrainian forces are. This is how depleted their arms and ammunition are. So this is the area outside Avdiivka. At the beginning of this year, Avdiivka was the front line. Russian forces have now moved all the way over to here. I'm going to switch between July 1st here and July 21st, and you can see the difference. You can see the incremental gains Russia is making, and people will say, well, those are very slow gains. This is Bakhmut. This is Chasiv Yar. You can see the difference between July 1st and July 21st. And the situation continues like that along the line of contact. People will say, well, that's not a very impressive achievement. Look how slow these territorial gains are, but we have to remind ourselves it's not a war of territorial conquest. Russia is not employing NATO-style maneuver warfare. This is a war of attrition. The primary objective is to grind down Ukrainian forces. Taking territory is secondary. Once the Ukrainian military is sufficiently ground down, Russia can take as much territory as it wants. This is the objective of this fighting, is to grind down Ukrainian forces, not to take large swaths of territory. We'll get into a little bit of that as we go into these articles. Let's start with this BBC article. This was actually from 3 days ago. It says right there, Europe must brace for decade of Ukraine war, NATO chief. And they're talking about Stoltenberg right here, pictured with Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky at the NATO summit. And this is what the article says. Asked if NATO allies had to be prepared for the conflict in Ukraine to go on for more than 10 years, Mr. Stoltenberg said yes. He added, but the main message is that the stronger the support for Ukraine and the longer we are willing to commit, the sooner this war can end. The paradox is that now President Putin believes that he can wait us out, so therefore the war continues. When we communicate very clearly that we are here for the long haul, that we have strong, enduring support for Ukraine, then we have the conditions for a solution where Ukraine prevails as a sovereign, independent state. It comes as NATO announced a command unit to coordinate support for Ukraine will be operational in Germany from September. Well, a couple of things here. Stoltenberg is talking about communicating the message that NATO is going to be able to outlast Russia. And you're communicating a message because you cannot demonstrate it tactically or strategically on the battlefield. So what they're really saying is they cannot outweigh Russia. Russia most certainly can outweigh NATO, and I will get into all the reasons why Russia will be able to outweigh NATO. The second point I'd like to make is the creation of this command unit in Germany to coordinate aid to Ukraine, support for Ukraine. This has already been going on. They just announced this to make it look like something is happening. And this is as a substitute for actual military support Ukraine would need if it were to try to outfight or outlast Russia. Let's look at this other article from Politico. Top NATO general praises Ukraine's great war strategy. Kiev is doing a good job of balancing recruitment, training, and procurement. This is according to General Christopher Cavoli. This is July 19th, 2024. The article says, although Ukrainian forces are being slowly pushed back in some places along the front, the country's overall military strategy is a good one, General Christopher Cavoli, NATO's top general, said during the Aspen Security Forum. The Aspen Institute is one of these government corporate-funded think tanks. This is where Western foreign and domestic policy is actually determined. Again, they write policy papers, they come to a consensus, they write policy papers, lawyers turn it into bills, it gets rubber stamped by Congress, gets signed off by the White House. That is how Western and more specifically US policy is determined. This is why it doesn't matter who you vote for, because it doesn't matter who is in office, they're going to sign off on it because this is where the policy comes from. And if you listen carefully to your candidate of choice, they're all saying almost verbatim what comes out of these policy think tanks. They're not coming up with these ideas on their own. Their policy advisors are from these think tanks. So it's important to know what the Aspen Institute and these other think tanks are when we cite them. So he was talking at this security forum. So the think tank has an annual event and he was speaking at it. The Ukrainians right now, for these past few months, have been focused on defending what they have in the east, denying Russia the free use of Crimea and southern Ukraine to attack the rest of Ukraine, preserving their access to the Black Sea and generating force. The US general said, I think they've got a great strategy. It's just a matter of prosecuting it. The key part is the force generation, Cavoli added in a speech at the US Security and Foreign Policy Conference. What he's admitting, especially in this opening sentence, although Ukrainian forces are being slowly pushed back along the front, Ukraine is losing. And then he's talking about generating force generation, mobilizing Ukrainian men into the armed forces. This is because of the astronomical losses Ukraine is suffering. They are losing entire brigades. They need to rebuild these brigades. They don't have the time, they don't have the personnel to train these people properly. They press men into service who do not want to fight. You have a force that generally degrades over time. Even if you have enough physical bodies along the line of contact, they are not properly trained. They are not effective soldiers. When you're trying to reconstitute a decimated brigade, you have positions that are filled by officers and non-commissioned officers. These are positions that require years of training and experience to fill. Ukraine is unable to do this. So this idea that, and it'll come up again in another article that I'm going to go over, the idea that in just a couple of months you can recruit several tens of thousands of men, train them, and then by late summer, early fall, you can go on the attack. You can organize a counter-offensive. This is unrealistic. General Cavoli talks about the Black Sea. This is what every Western analyst, commentator, military and political leader does when the subject of Ukraine comes up and there is a lack of Ukrainian progress on the battlefield. They say, well, look at the Black Sea. We forced the Russian Black Sea fleet to move further east. The role of the Black Sea fleet in this conflict is to launch cruise missiles at targets all across Ukraine. Those ships can launch those cruise missiles no matter where they are located in the Black Sea. They talk about how pushing the Black Sea fleet further east allows Ukraine to conduct maritime trade. If Russia wanted to interdict that trade, they could. They have made the conscious decision not to escalate to that point, but that is a point of escalation that they hold in reserve. This should be remembered. And the trade that Ukraine is conducting through the Black Sea is not going to save the Ukrainian economy at this point. 80% of their non-nuclear power production has been destroyed. That's just one of many actual facts to ground this conversation in reality. He's also talking about denying the free use of Crimea by Russia. They have not done this in any shape, form, or way. They have conducted sporadic missile attacks on targets across Crimea. This is a very big peninsula. There is a multitude of military installations there. Military forces are based there. They operate out of there. Nothing in this article indicates that the free use of Crimea by Russian forces has somehow been denied. If it has been, they forgot to mention how in the article. So we're getting a lot of articles like this by very senior Western military and political leaders where they're openly admitting that Ukraine is losing, but then they try to spin it as if it isn't all that bad. And we have to remember how the story arc has gone from Ukraine is winning to it's a stalemate to yes, they're losing, but they're not losing that badly. They can still turn things around. I think you could see where the trajectory of this narrative. Let's go to this article. Again, another article. CNN, July 15th, 2024, the West finally allowed Ukraine to strike back at Russia, and it seems to be working. But when you read the article, it seems like it made absolutely no difference at all. Let's read through it. After many months on the back foot because of ammunition and manpower shortages, Kiev is finally able to take full advantage of Western military aid that started to flow into the country last month after months of delays. Soldiers on the front lines say the deliveries are beginning to make a difference, especially since they can now use the arsenal to strike across the border at certain military targets supporting Russia's offensive in Ukraine. Do they substantiate that? And I'll just quickly tell you, no, they don't. They don't substantiate that claim. It continues. It says, while Kiev hasn't managed to reclaim large swaths of territory, it has successfully averted what could have been a disaster, the occupation of Kharkov, Ukraine's second city. This is ridiculous. This is a completely fabricated claim. It is an objective that Russia never had. When they launched their incursion into Kharkov, it was to create a buffer zone near the border. It was to open up another front to overstretch Ukrainian forces. That is exactly what they achieved. The force that is operating in that area is not nearly large enough to approach, encircle, take, or secure Kharkov. Even if the Ukrainian forces broke and retreated to the Dnieper River, Russia would still have to mobilize more men, draw them off from somewhere else to bring them to Kharkov to properly secure the city. So this is an objective Russia never had. They have fabricated this objective, assigned it to Russia, and then claimed that there was a big victory in defeating Russia from achieving this objective. It is a narrative born out of desperation. Now, about the authorization to strike targets in Russian territory. This is what it says. According to Ukrainian defense authorities, these included a regiment command post in Belgorod region, an ammunition depot, a drone facility, and an airfield, a communication center, and several naval sites in occupied Crimea. Now, here's the reality. They've been carrying out strikes like this throughout the entire conflict, including inside Russian territory. Maybe not with Western weapons, but they have been carrying out strikes like this all along. And in regards to Crimea specifically, they had been using Western weapons long before this whole issue of needing authorization to strike into Russian territory became a talking point. They were using Storm Shadow and Scalp air-launched cruise missiles, also ATACMS and HIMARS to strike targets in Crimea. Has made absolutely no difference. And as a matter of fact, that is what they're telling you in this article. The only difference that it made was stopping Russia from taking Kharkov when Russia wasn't even trying to take Kharkov, the city, the large urban center in Kharkov region. And then it says, but while the new weapons are making some difference, Ukraine is long off from being able to push Russian forces off its territory. So they're In this article, they begin by pretending that Ukraine is having success, and then eventually they admit that no, they're not. Things are pretty dire, and the ability to actually reverse the tide in this conflict is near non-existent. And then the article, this is how it essentially ends. It says, Konrad Muzuka, an independent defense analyst and the director of Rokin Consulting, who has recently returned from eastern Ukraine, said that while Ukraine has managed to recruit a significant number of men over the past month and a half, it will take time for these new soldiers to be trained up and ready for the front lines. Ukrainians are going to be in a very difficult position until August, September, when the first mobilized guys start to enter the front line. So we're just talking about 2 or 3 months for some of these mobilized men reaching the front. And as I pointed out many times before, an entry-level infantryman needs at least half a year of training. They're not going to get anywhere near that. And we've talked about the quality of that training. The Western media has talked about this training, how absolutely inadequate it is. Sometimes they'll get only 20 rounds to practice with before they're sent to the front line. Entirely inadequate, almost as bad as not preparing them at all. If they get to that point, so they're saying if they're able to train up these men who have been pressed into service over 2 or 3 months, if they can get to that point, if they can make it until then there's a big likelihood that they will manage to stabilize the situation from August onwards. But until this happens, more Russian gains are highly likely. And this, again, this is not analysis. This is at best wishful thinking, at worst deliberately dishonest propaganda to encourage this conflict to continue grinding on, to Ukraine's detriment. He also said that with the new weapons arriving and battalions and brigades getting a boost soon from new recruits, again, recruits with next to no training, Ukraine will need to decide on its next steps. It's unclear what the plans are. What's the strategy for counter-offensives? The problem is that Ukraine is waiting to see what equipment the West can supply them with, and the West is waiting to see what plans Ukraine has for the future, he said. And again, this is nonsense. This is America's proxy war against Russia. Ukraine is not deciding anything. They are simply a conduit through which military equipment, training, other resources flow to wage a proxy war against Russia. And so it's not as if the US doesn't know what Ukraine's going to do next, so they're waiting on sending weapons. They're out of weapons. They don't have any other weapons to send Ukraine. Now people will say, well, they do have weapons to send. They do. They have what they can draw off monthly production month to month, which isn't a lot. It's obviously not enough. So what we see is a general degradation of Ukrainian fighting capacity. It is slowly contracting to the point where eventually it will collapse. We don't know when that will be, but we can definitely see, even now, day by day, Ukrainian fighting capacity is contracting. I want to make another point here, a point that I've made many times before. This narrative that you see woven into every single one of these articles, that there was some sort of funding delay in the United States. That is what has created Ukraine's misfortune. Now that the funding delay has been addressed, the money and the weapons are now flowing again, Ukraine has an opportunity to turn the tide against Russia. This is false. The conflict was already turning for the worse long before the delay began. I remember going over the assistance packages before the funding delay and pointing out how they were getting smaller and smaller, both in terms of quantity and the quality of the weapons provided, going from Stingers and Patriots to Hawk air defense systems. Just one example, a system that should be in a museum right now. That is being sent to Ukraine because the United States simply doesn't have enough Stingers and Patriots to send Ukraine. Speaking of arms and ammunition, let's start getting into that in more detail. Now, Alexander Mikhailis pointed out to me a Reuters article. This Reuters article here. Years of miscalculations by US, NATO led to dire shell shortage in Ukraine. Now, if you have been following my work or that of Alexander Mikhailis, Alex Christoforou of the Duran, Mark Sloboda, Scott of Calibrated, we have all been talking about this for months, if not years. The the very nature of the collective West's military industrial base, the way they reconfigured their military for decades following the Cold War to fight small wars all around the globe, the way their ability to wage large-scale protracted warfare, how that has all atrophied, and how difficult it is to get that back up and running even under the most ideal conditions, but how the collective West's for-profit system makes it almost impossible to do so. So here is Reuters finally admitting to all of this. 2 years plus into the conflict. In a way, a follow-up of this article. This is something else Alexander Mercouris had pointed out. This Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty article, EU shell production capacity, supplies to Ukraine fall far short of promises. So they were talking about 1.7 million shells by the end of this year. But it's much closer to 570,000, less than 570,000 rounds per year. So that was Europe calculating that they would reach to 1.7 million by the end of this year. They're not even close. It is a third of that. And Alexander Mercouris has repeatedly said about US projections of future shell production that those were unlikely to be achieved in the time frame given. So let's just look at this article. This article from Reuters is going to give us some insight as to why it is unlikely the US will meet its target. So the article says, on the front lines near this old industrial city, soldiers in the trenches say a shortage of an all-important munition, the 155mm artillery shell, has turned the war in Russia's favor. Many of them blame the supply crunch on the US Congress for failing to quickly approve a $60 billion military aid package, which passed after months of delay in April. The US and European nations have pledged that assistance is on its way, but while fresh supplies have been delivered, Ukraine is still massively outgunned. So what they eventually explained is that no, it's not about the funding delay, which is what I had been saying all along. It has nothing to do with the funding delay. The ammunition simply doesn't exist. It doesn't exist to send to Ukraine in the quantities Ukraine requires. So Reuters says the cause of the shell crisis began years ago. They are rooted in decisions and miscalculations made by the US military and its NATO allies that occurred well before Russia's 2022 invasion. A Reuters investigation found a decade of strategic funding and production mistakes played a far greater role in the shell shortage than did the recent US congressional delays of aid, Reuters found. Now, in this article, they have a graph. I will show you this graph right here. This is US shell production for 155mm artillery shells, 2016 to 2026. Okay, so we can see the gradual rise here from 2022 to 2024, the projections for 2025 here at 60,000 and 100,000 by 2026. Now these are very large leaps. They're very large leaps. Does the article describe a military industrial base in the United States that would be capable of making these leaps? But let's just say that by 2026, the US is able to make 100,000 artillery shells per month. That's per month. And let's just say Europe, which is only able to make 47,000 shells per month, let's say they're able to double it. Even if they were able to do all of this, they would still be making fewer artillery shells in 2026 than Russia is currently manufacturing right now, according to the Western media itself. This is from CNN. I've referenced this article many times. It's the West itself admitting this. Russia producing 3 times more artillery shells than US and Europe for Ukraine. 3 million a year. 3 million a year now. The US and Europe combined will be making less than 3 million even in 2026. So this is the situation that Ukraine is in the middle of amid what is essentially an artillery war, a land war where artillery is central in it. So then this Reuters article starts talking about the initial flood of artillery ammunition into Ukraine. This was coming from Western stockpiles. Whatever they were able to spare was exhausted. We don't know what the size of these stockpiles are. We don't know how much is left in them. But what they felt they could spare and keep on hand for other contingencies, that was exhausted, and now they're drawing from monthly production. You have to remember that this number, 2.4 million, between the US and Europe by 2026, and that is a big if. That's if every single one of those shells goes to Ukraine. They most likely will not. So it'll be much less than that in terms of what is arriving in Ukraine. So then the article is talking about how after the stockpiles were exhausted and this process of drawing what could be spared from monthly production would begin, this is what they say. By summer 2023, US officials told Ukraine that its forces should be ready for a reduced supply of shells in 2024. Barely half of the 2 million rounds of 155 millimeter they had ended up receiving in 2023. US officials told Ukraine they should adjust their warfare approach and live with a reduced supply of shells. So there you go. Encouraging them to continue fighting on without providing them the means to do so. And even with the ammunition they were receiving from the collective West before their stockpiles were exhausted, it still wasn't enough. Now it surely is not enough. And they are telling you right now, as plainly as possible, that this is a problem that will not be solved anytime in the near future. And even as money is now being talked about being invested in expanding production, you have to remember you're investing it in a for-profit industrial base, which means the more money you sink into it, the more these private enterprises are going to try to profit from it. The more you put in, the more they're going to try to find a way to take that money, do the absolute bare minimum that's expected of them, and pocket the rest as profit. This has to be kept in mind. What about Russia? I've talked about purpose-driven military-industrial production in Russia and also China. This is what it says. Russia, meanwhile, has been expanding several gunpowder plants, all that date back to at least World War II. Its plant in the city of Kazan once made gunpowder for Catherine the Great. Even after demand fell following the collapse of the USSR, Russia managed to keep it open. Its plants there and in Perm and Tambov, in part by diversifying into the supply of liquid nitrocellulose for civilian use as paints and lacquer. So this is what Russia did versus what the US did. The US said, this isn't making us money, get rid of it. Get rid of it, we don't need it. It's not making us money. Russia said, this is central to national security. We need to keep all of these capabilities. Even if we're not using them right now, we need to be able to use them at a moment's notice. Let's keep it. Let's find creative ways to keep these factories operating, the equipment in use and up to date, repaired by creating civilian applications for some of these processes. But then when it comes to military production, we can switch over very quickly, which is what they've done, which is why they're outproducing both the United States and Europe at the same time. And if that's what Russia is doing, just imagine what China will be able to do. Now, we've always heard that the reason the West has chosen a profit-driven industry is because it supposedly spurs innovation better than, say, in Russia or China. But we know that's not true, because as the conflict in Ukraine is proving, not only is Russia able to make more of everything, a lot of their weapon systems are simply better than American systems, the systems that are being handed over to Ukrainians for them to use against Russia. And so what ends up happening is a for-profit system is only efficient at making lots of money. In every other way, it is a failure. It does not spur in more innovation, and it simply does not fulfill the practical needs of a nation state. Now, what's interesting about this Reuters investigation is that it is repeating the now verified lie that Europe is somewhere near making 2 million shells a year. They're not anywhere near making 2 million shells a year. I just read the previous article from US government-funded Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, saying that it's a third of that, a third of 1.7 million shells. But it's interesting that this Reuters article is repeating that claim because they're saying that even though it's bad, the situation is pretty bad, it's very slow expanding artillery shell production, but at least Europe is almost at 2 million shells when, no, they're not. They're at around 550,000, 570,000, somewhere in there. This is what Reuters concludes the article by saying, back on the front line, Ukraine soldiers hope that the efforts work and fast. Talking about expanding artillery shell production. Well, we can see that it isn't, and it won't be fast. One lieutenant who commanded a gun in the southern Donetsk region told Reuters that for months he had fired so infrequently that the Russians didn't even bother to shell his position. New supplies have arrived, he said, but he feared they were too late and too little to stop the Russians. What we have is still a pittance, Alexander said. We are retreating village by village until we reach our homes. And this is exactly what I said. Now that the funding delay is over and the ammunition is flowing, the amount of ammunition is still absolutely insufficient. Nowhere near what Ukraine requires, even just to maintain their positions along the line of contact. And that is what the Ukrainians themselves are telling Reuters. Let's talk about drones, because what we'll always hear is that, well, maybe the United States and Europe can't mass produce artillery shells, but somehow they're going to mass produce much more complicated drones. And I've talked about this before. Eric Schmidt, ex-CEO of Google, quietly created a company called White Stork, which plans to build AI-powered attack drones, report says. And this was all the way back in January 2024. But I keep hearing these rumors that the US, Europe, Ukraine, they're going to make this huge swarm of AI-powered drones that are just going to overwhelm Russia. I'm hearing it referred to as the Oppenheimer moment. So let's get into a little bit of this. Let's just read from this older Business Insider article first. The former Google chief told Wired that occasionally a new weapon comes to market that changes things and that AI could help revolutionize the Department of Defense equipment. He said in the Wired interview, Einstein wrote a letter to Roosevelt in the 1930s saying that there is this new technology, nuclear weapons, that could change war, which it clearly did. I would argue that AI-powered autonomy and decentralized distributed systems are that powerful. Well, number one, Eric Schmidt is no Einstein. That is number one. That's very important. Number two, it's not the year 1930 anymore. That's also really important to understand. And we're hearing this talk about Einstein, Oppenheimer, the atomic bomb, this mythological story that we hear repeated over and over again, how it turned the war, ended the war in America's favor, World War II. By the time the United States dropped the first atomic bomb on Japan, it literally did not have a fleet. I think if you look it up, they may have had one capital ship left, and one capital ship does not make a fleet. So they literally did not have a fleet. They had no means at all whatsoever to threaten the United States. They were utterly defeated. And the only thing that they were arguing about were the terms of surrender. And so the United States said, we're not compromising with you, and if you don't do what we tell you, one atomic bomb, and then a second atomic bomb, and then the Japanese completely subordinated themselves to the United States and their every demand. That's the true story of the atomic bomb. The United States was able to arrive at building an atomic bomb first because it had one of two of the largest industrial bases on the planet at the time. The other was the Soviet Union, which shortly followed with their own atomic bomb and then nuclear arsenal. Even without nuclear weapons, the United States and the Soviet Union were inevitably going to win World War II. It was inevitable. There was no way Germany, Japan, Italy could conceivably win that war. It was all about industrial base. The US industrial base or the Soviet industrial base alone dwarfed the Axis powers. These two industrial bases combined made it absolutely impossible. There was not even a shred of a doubt that it would end in the favor of the Allies. Now today, The United States does not have the largest industrial base on Earth. China does. The idea that you can monopolize technology today is completely irrational and unrealistic. It is, in other words, it is impossible. There's nothing that the United States can develop that Russia and China can't just then replicate. And also vice versa. It could take some time, but it's not going to take a lot of time. They're going to be able to recreate it and then benefit from it in short order. I want to also point something out, because Americans will try to convince the world that, well, maybe we're not good in industrial production, but we're great at coding. Our AI is second to none, and that's the Oppenheimer, Einstein advantage we have over the rest of the world. But it just simply isn't true. So I was looking at this Forbes article, supply chain drones. So it's not really about the military, but in this article, it talks about US government laboratories developing AI applications. And when they're describing this application, they refer to a Chinese university that already developed a capability very similar to it. And the point that I'm trying to make here is that whatever the United States thinks it's going to design, develop in terms of software or in terms of hardware, this is not something they monopolize anymore. The world has significantly changed since the 1930s, 40s, 50s, when they did actually have a monopoly on industrial and intellectual power. They no longer have that monopoly. As a matter of fact, if there is an advantage, it lies with China, and it's just because of the sheer scale of their, not just their industrial base, but their education system and the intellectual power that they are developing across their population. Now, we hear Eric Schmidt and others talking about we can't make enough artillery shells or missiles. We're out of air defense systems, but we can make these drones. And maybe to try to close the gap, we don't have enough workers, we don't have enough skilled workers. Maybe we can use robots, right? I hear this all the time. These think tanks have experts who are constantly talking about, well, we can't find enough workers, let's just use robots, let's just automate all of our factories. The problem is, America is not the only country that has access to industrial robots. They're not the only country that's able to automate a factory. As a matter of fact, if you look at the center of robotic industrial power, it is also China. And I just want to show you the scale at which this shift is taking place. Let's start with this European Commission report. World Robotics Report 2020 by International Federation of Robots. So they're talking about the distribution of industrial robots around the world. And it says operational stock of industrial robots. Blue is Asia. Red, Europe. This bluish gray color, the Americas. Okay, and you can see how Asia has always had an advantage, and the advantage just keeps increasing. According to the latest figures, in 2019, there was a record of 2.7 million industrial robots operating in factories around the world, with an increase of 12% in comparison with 2018. Asia remains the strongest market for industrial robots, with China reaching 783,000 operational units, with an increase of 21%. Japan, 355,000. Europe, all of Europe, less than China. All of Europe. And then they talk about Germany in particular. The US is the largest industrial robot user in the Americas, reaching an operational stock of about 293,000 units. Now, you could say that, well, if you add up all of America's, Europe's, and Japan's robots, it's more than China's. But you're underestimating the advantage a nation has by having that many robots within one single integrated economy. The United States, Europe, and Japan do not have an integrated economy. They're talking about combining their industrial power because they can see that any one of them is outcompeted by China. And the way they are producing weapons, equipment, ammunition, they're still being even collectively, they're still, the way they're doing it now, they're being outproduced by just Russia alone, saying nothing of China. And the thing is, it's not going to work because, as you can see, China is just exponentially outpacing them every single year, is more and more. And just to make it more clear, here's another article from Statista. China leads growth of global industrial robot stock. Global installations in 2022. This is China. This is the whole rest of the world. So again, this was 2019. This is 2022. This is how quickly China has expanded the use of industrial robots. So obviously, the collective West isn't going to be able to use robots to outproduce China because China has by far more robots. And each year, they have more industrial robots that allow them to automate more and more of their production. Plus, they just have a much larger workforce, a larger skilled workforce and a much larger unskilled workforce that they can tap into. And I've showed this many times before. This is a 2017 Forbes article, the countries with the most STEM graduates. And it's an infographic, and if you zoom in, China graduates millions more STEM graduates every single year than the United States. 4.7 million versus around 500,000. Russia, with a much smaller population, has a comparable number of STEM graduates as the US. So as far as skilled labor, China is by far benefiting from a much larger pool of skilled labor. So what is the other possible solution? I actually heard Christian Bros of Anduril, this is one of these startup high-tech weapons companies, selling the Pentagon overpriced weapons that don't work. A number of these weapon systems were already sent to Ukraine, never to be heard from again. And he was talking about how we cannot find skilled labor to mass produce these weapons in the quantities needed to match or exceed Russia or China. What we need to do is design weapon systems that unskilled labor or existing pools of labor can assemble, such as the auto industry. Workers drawn from the auto industry could come in and make these weapon systems.
We're in the process of raising a lot of money, and we're going to put a lot of that money into really changing the way we approach defense manufacturing. It's a much longer answer, but to the workforce piece, back to this question of a core requirement needs to be systems that are simpler to build, that are more mass producible. I think one of the core criteria for us is, as much as possible, can you not make systems dependent on highly specialized workers and highly manual processes? How do you make defense systems and weapons that are mass producible by the largest labor pools available? Where I can start to tap into commercial automotive labor pools, where it doesn't require large amounts of retraining. It doesn't require large amounts of specialized education. That's kind of the focus for us, because our focus going in is we have to be able to produce at hyperscale. Like, large scale is done. Unless and until we are producing orders of magnitude more, we're not even close to solving the problem as it actually exists. And like Ukraine, as stressing as an event as that has been for the defense industrial base, pales in comparison to what a China contingency is going to look like. So if we're failing at Ukraine, we're not even close to being where we need to be for responding to a China contingency, and that's what Anduril is focused on.
The problem is, whatever weapon system you come up with, Russia and China are going to look at it. If they're not already making something comparable, they will. And then they will apply their much larger skilled workforce and also unskilled workforce to the problems. The United States is in an unwinnable competition, but is it a competition the US should be involved in the first place? Is the very premise that US foreign policy is based on, is that fundamentally flawed, meaning that everything else built on top of it is likewise flawed and destined to fail? And I would say yes. If the premise that the US builds its foreign policy on is primacy over the rest of the world, a tiny minority of the planet controlling the whole rest of the planet, that is fundamentally flawed. And everything that you try to build on top of that is going to be likewise skewed, unbalanced, unsustainable, It reminds me of a tropism. In nature, a tropism is a response that turns an organism entirely in one direction. This is in response to factors in its environment. So if you put a seed of a tree in the ground, there is rich soil, there is moisture, it's raining, that tree is going to try to grow as big and as fast as possible. It's going to drive its roots as deep as possible. It's going to stretch its branches and its leaves out as wide and as high as possible. It is responding to the environment as it is now. It is not anticipating what the future holds. It doesn't know that maybe it should conserve its energy because next year there might be a drought. It doesn't know to do that. And so it assumes tremendous proportions that ultimately make it unsustainable to survive when that drought finally does happen. And the United States and Europe have done something very similar. For generations, they enjoyed vast disparity over the rest of the world in terms of military and economic power. And just like a tropism, it turned the collective West toward empire, toward subjugation, exploitation, expansion, all around the globe. But just like a tropism in nature, it did not anticipate a future where there would be a balance of military and economic power around the globe, and that the proportions of their empire would eventually become a liability and even threaten its very survival. Now, the good thing about human beings, human civilization, a nation state, is that we have our ability to reason. We have the ability to innovate, and we can look at this unsustainable foreign policy, the flawed premise that it's built on, and we can change it. We don't have to accept the inevitability of the American system simply collapsing. And we don't have to accept the inevitability of fighting devastating wars with either Russia or China or both, wars that we cannot win. We do not have to do that. We are not obligated to do that. We can change. The West could easily look at the emerging multipolar world and find a constructive place within it. They do not have to maintain primacy over the rest of the world. They can work together with the rest of the world. If they choose to continue fighting the rest of the world to maintain unsustainable primacy over the world, then they will collapse like all empires before it, and it will end in death and destruction. And the only question is how much and for how long. And I think that's what Russia, China, the rest of the multi-world that is emerging, I think that is what occupies much of the direction of their foreign policy. So that's where we are in Ukraine. And as I always say, Ukraine is connected to the overall objective of European foreign policy. Maintaining primacy over the planet is to encircle and contain Russia. It's also to encircle and contain China, and to prevent a multipolar world from taking shape, from irreversibly ending Western hegemony over the planet. That's where the real battle lines are. That's what this conflict in Ukraine is all about. It's not an isolated incident. It's one of many all around the globe unfolding right now. I will keep an eye on the conflict in Ukraine, as well as the growing tensions here in Asia Pacific, where I am located. There's also ongoing conflicts in the Middle East, again, all connected to the same central driving principle, the West's desire for hegemony over the entire planet, not just parts of it. Until then, if you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. Check the video description for all of the links that I referenced in this video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize any of the social media platforms that I share my work on. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. To everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation or donations month to month, or if you have no extra resources and you're just helping share my work with others, that is all greatly appreciated. All of that is what makes this work possible. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.